The property is explored for epithermal gold, silver, and copper porphyry. And it's strategically located, I say, on the island of Newfoundland. And I say strategic because most copper porphyry deposits around the world are located on the Pacific Rim. And this will be one of the few that are located on the North Atlantic seaboard. Tellurium is actually a critical metal and a key component in solar panels. It's probably actually one of the rarest of the critical metals. Currently, about 90% of the world's tellurium is produced in China. And I say we're seeing significant tellurium at root and cellar. So access is quite incredible for an untouched epithermal gold and porphyry copper system. These are always often halfway up the mountains. If you look at BC or Chile or in jungles, if you look at the southern Pacific Rim.
Hello, everyone, and thanks for tuning in for another live Northern Shield market update. If this is your first time joining a SIX call, please note this event is being recorded and you can watch the replay at six.com or on our YouTube channel shortly after we conclude today. Also, we encourage participation, so please feel free to submit your questions using the chat feature, which can be found in the bottom right corner of your screen. We are joined by Ian Bliss, President and CEO. Ian will first go through a quick presentation, then we'll open it up to questions. So with that said, Ian, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Kyle, and good afternoon or good morning, everyone, depending on where in Canada or the world you sit. And a particular welcome to those Labrador Gold shareholders who may be joining us for the first time. So the presentation is an update on the root and cellar property in Newfoundland, an intact epithermal and porphyry gold system. And it's very similar to the presentation I gave at the CIA Mineral Resource Review Conference in St. John's last month. Before I start the presentation, I do have to bring your attention to the forward-looking statements, as this presentation will contain forward-looking statements. So root and cellar is located in the Avalon geological terrain in southeastern Newfoundland. The property is explored for epithermal gold, silver, and copper porphyry. And it's strategically located, I say, on the island of Newfoundland. And I say strategic because most copper porphyry deposits around the world are located on the Pacific Rim. And this will be one of the few that are located on the North Atlantic seaboard. So it's very easily accessed. It's about 3.5 hours from St. John's, the capital of Newfoundland, and only about 10 minutes at best from a deep water port. And we'll have a closer look at that later. But it is in an area called the Avalon terrain, broadly similar to perhaps the BC Golden Triangle, but just a lot less explored and much more accessible. So the root and cellar is located in a very distinct topographic low within the Burin Peninsula. And this is one of the sort of features that, prior to auctioning the property, we took cognizance of because, as I say, we're looking for features that perhaps suggest that root and cellar was a little bit different than the surrounding other epithermal deposits in the Avalon terrain. So we see this very distinct break in the topographic map, as you see on the right-hand side. Is basically a lowland here. The property sits on a little bit of a ridge within that lowland. And we see the very same break in the magnetic signature. So we believe that was actually an extension regime. Most of the Avalon terrain was created by collisions, so rocks coming apart. But at one point, we believe there is a bit of an extension or rifting. And that's important for epithermal and porphyry copper deposits because it basically creates greater magmatic activity. And if you create greater magmatic activity, you have the ability to also create greater hydrothermal fluid flow. And so it's very distinct from the surrounding rocks. When we look at the geochemistry, they're bimodal at root and cellar, and that's very, very conducive to, say, an extension arc regime. And that's potentially where you get larger copper porphyry systems as well as epithermal gold. So right from the get-go, there is something very unique about the geological terrain surrounding root and cellar. So I said the root and cellar is really being bookended by two main commodities, and that is gold and copper, as I say, because it is a related epithermal gold and porphyry copper system. These things are related. I say it's bookended by those commodities, but we also have significant moly, tellurium, silver, and a little bit of lead and zinc as well. And so this model is kind of a general model of an epithermal and porphyry copper system. The porphyry copper typically sits on top of some sort of intrusion at depth, and you have your various low sulfidation deposits, intermediate, and then low being usually the furthest away or the highest above that intrusion that's supporting the copper porphyry. So this is kind of what we believe is happening at root and cellar. And so we have all the components from a low sulfidation and now seeing the evidence of a copper porphyry. But they are end members of the same magmatic hydrothermal system. The unusual thing is usually the copper porphyry, if you're seeing the gold, then the copper porphyry is typically several thousand meters deeper than the gold, in which case you don't see it. But for various reasons, you get telescoping or other features that now sort of project or telescope the copper porphyry onto the gold-bearing level. So it's a very unique circumstance, and we believe that's happening at Root and Cellar. I mentioned tellurium. Tellurium is a significant component at Root and Cellar for a variety of reasons. Tellurium is actually a critical metal and a key component in solar panels. It's probably actually one of the rarest of the critical metals. And you really only find it in economic quantities as a byproduct of these type of epithermal gold and porphyry copper deposits. Currently, about 90% of the world's tellurium is produced in China. And I say we're seeing significant tellurium at Root and Cellar, both extensive low grade in and around the Conquest zone in the center, 10 to 20 ppm, but we have it up to 700 ppm in some zones and 300 ppm associated with the moly and the copper and the Crescent copper showing. So very, very extensive and good grades of tellurium mineralization. We see that in several minerals, hesite with the silver, and more recently when we were drilling for gold this summer, we came across what looks like crenorite, which is a gold telluride, associated with the coliform, cruciform banded quartz veins. But it's important because not only is tellurium a critical metal, but often when you find it in this setting, it's indicative of very large epithermal gold and porphyry copper systems. So just a quick overview for those that are not familiar with the Root and Cellar property. It really is composed of right now 5 gold showings over about a 6-kilometer strike length. Along the northern flank of the uplands, we have drop zone, Windfall, and Braxton Bradley. These are really characterized by very high silver to gold ratios, so they're silver rich and also generally very tellurium rich. In the center of that, we have the Conquest zone where much of our work is focused to date. There's also tellurium there, though a little bit lower grade with gold. Right now, actually, we have up to 111 grams per ton gold in a boulder. I say this is where most of the work is focused to date. But the really recent developments are on what we call the Crescent copper zone, which is a very large anomaly consisting of soil and rock samples in the southwest portion of the property. And most of this presentation will really focus on that copper-bearing zone. But Northern Shield is the very first company to explore this project. The only portion of it that's been explored by another junior company was Braxton Bradley about 20 years ago. And the furthest they get along was about 100 meters of drilling and 3 wink eaters holes. So not much exploration. This was discovered by a local prospector, and we're the first company, as I say, to conduct methodical exploration on the project site. Having a quick look at the Conquest zone, it's a very large footprint, about 4 square kilometers. That's composed of both rock samples, anomalous and gold, represented by the squares, and then the dots are anomalous soil samples. So in some areas, you see very distinct dispersion trains, following the trend of the ice direction, so that sort of suggests there's another source of gold up in this area that we've yet to find, but most of it's in the southern Conquest zone. Let's say up to 111 grams per ton gold in boulders. We haven't found a source of those specific boulders yet. They don't come from where we've been drilling, and they're certainly very, very local. Any boulders that we find on the property have typically moved tens of meters or maybe a few hundred, but there's very short transport distances. So a very big footprint of gold mineralization, still a lot of drilling to do. We've only drilled, I think, 34 drill holes on the property since optioning it in 2019. And we generally believe that the Conquest zone is probably linked up to Windfall somehow at depth through a vein system. These hash marks are IP anomalies, and you can see again in this IP anomaly, we seem to get gold where that IP anomaly outcrops on either side of this ridge up in here. So still a lot of work to do on the gold side, and that's only one of the real 5 gold occurrences we have on the property. The other thing about Conquest zone, there's considerable visible gold that we're finding there, we see it both in drill core and in surface sampling. Just having a little bit of closer look at the southern Conquest zone, I say where most of the drilling has taken place to date, including a drill program earlier on this summer. Really the best result in that program was 4.3 meters of 3.4 grams per ton gold with some tellurium. But interesting, that was the first time we see what we call coliform or ginguro banding in these coliform crustiform banded quartzine. So these are very indicative of epithermal gold systems, and they tell you're getting into the boiling zone. It's in the boiling zone in epithermal gold, which is where your better gold grades are expected. So all the sampling to date, including the drilling up in this area, was basically very, very shallow in the system. In fact, we know in this drilling here, we're at the very, very top of the epithermal system, essentially equivalent to Yellowstone Park, where you have that geyser coming out. 500 million years ago, you would have had a very similar geyser gushing out hydrothermal fluids here. And when you're in that zone, you're actually above the boiling zone, so you don't typically get a lot of gold, but we are seeing a lot of gold. And that bodes very well as to what we may find deeper down in the system. Say we this year too, we jumped quite deep down to the 300 or 400 meter level. Mostly hit alteration. We did hit a few spots down in the south where we're hitting the structures at depth, but most of the gold is so far is contained within about 40, 50 meters of surface. This was actually the deepest part of the vein we've hit to date at about 100 meters below surface. So we're following up on this intersection in the next drill program at Root and Cellar. But now moving on to the Crescent copper zone, which is this very large 2-kilometer diameter copper anomaly in the southwest portion of the property. As I say, the yellow dots, so the green dots are soil samples anomalous in copper, and the green are all rock samples, surface samples collected. So you can see some very significant grades, including 10.5% copper. That was from this chalcocite-bearing sample, so that typically represents what we call supergene enrichment. So after the mineralization formed, other fluids sort of flushed out some of the sulfides, enriching it in the metals. But most of the copper to date are found around this area here. Again, still very good grades, up to nearly 9% copper. And they're found in these quarries that are being operated by third parties, which we'll now have a closer look at. I say these quarries are basically what they're doing. They're quarrying these what we call diatreme breccias, and these are important in the understanding of these porphyry copper systems too, because they are formed by basically explosive eruption where hot magma interacts with the cold water table and creates a steam explosion that fragments the rock, and that gives lots of opportunities for mineralized fluids to then come up these cracks and fill around these voids. And so they're third party. There's obviously a difference between quarrying rights. We have the exploration rights and the mining rights, but a third party has the quarrying rights. And they like these things because they're made up of rhyolitic fragments. Rhyolite is very hard, so it's good for road gravel, but they fragment naturally along those boundaries. So they're quarrying these diatreme breccias, and in doing so, it's like pre-trenching for us on a giant scale because they're exposing a lot of the mineralization. Again, all these green squares are copper-bearing samples collected by the prospector very early on in the process, some of them before Northern Shield got involved. But this year in particular, they've been moving westward. And as they move westward, they've been exposing some new mineralization and rock types, which will show you, which are very key to the sort of evidence of this copper porphyry system and what really changed things around partway through the season. But, a rare and kind of a unique opportunity where we're having essentially a third party making money off of what we hope is removing the waste rock to a copper porphyry system. Moving closer into these quarries, we came across 3 critical pieces of evidence, mostly this summer, but throughout the exploration program at Root and Cellar over the past few years. And we'll have a closer look at that, but that is copper mineralization hosted in the diatreme breccia itself, some hydrothermal breccia veins, and some fragments that host actual what we look like copper porphyry mineralization. So starting with the breccia hosted copper, as I say, this is very chunky chalcopyrite forming in either veins or large sort of void fillings around some of these fragments. And I say most of the copper appears to be near what we think is the wall rock of this diatreme breccia. Obviously, that's where your weakest structures are. So any mineralized fluids are going to be able to rise to surface much more rapidly along that contact of the diatreme pipe. So we think the copper we're seeing is mostly near the wall rock or contact of the diatreme pipe with the surrounding rock. But because this is hosted right within the diatreme breccia itself, this tells us that this mineralization is coeval or formed at the same time as that diatreme breccia did. But we'll move along now to some of the porphyry copper mineralization. And here within one of the fragments within the diatreme breccia, we're seeing chalcopyrite, molybdenite mineralization along these little fractures, and it's a very silicified and potassic rich rock. There's also a lot of disseminated chalco. It's a little bit harder to see in this image, but we see both disseminated copper mineralization as well as vein mineralization. And this fragment looks quite like it's probably primary copper porphyry mineralization. But because it's hosted in the diatreme, we now know that that mineralization was actually formed prior to the formation of the diatreme pipe itself. And then we also see similar looking chalcopyrite bearing quartz veins, but these actually transverse both the fragments and the matrix of the diatreme breccia. And so that tells us it's actually formed after the diatreme breccia. And the reason that's important is because when we now see copper mineralization before the formation of the diatreme pipe, during the formation of the diatreme pipe, and now after the formation of the diatreme pipe. So that tells you it's a very active system and long-lived system, and that's what you want to see as potential for a very large deposit or any deposit, because large deposits are grown. They're not formed instantaneously, they're grown. So the longer they live, the bigger they can be. This photo too also shows some native copper. We see that quite regularly in small amounts. This is one of the biggest little blobs of native copper that we see also within that diatreme pipe. And then, one of the key discoveries this summer was this hydrothermal breccia within the diatreme pipe. And we see that as this very sort of black, sooty looking rock, very silicious, made up of what we call silica ooze, and then brecciated with a lot of pyrite in the matrix. But we see a lot of these banded fragments. And so that tells us that these were actually tiny little pools of water that would have formed around that geyser as it ejected to the surface. So, 500 million years ago, this would have been the surface, the paleo surface. You would have had something like Yellowstone geyser gushing out the top, and that formed a little pond. And so when we see these fragments, we know we're right at the very top of the system within this diatreme pipe. So this is basically hosted within the diatreme pipe. So again, we know it came later than at least one phase of the diatreme. So a very, very active system. I say this is anomalous in gold, moly, pathfinders like, arsenic and tellurium. These are the classic, indicator minerals you're going to get, especially at the top of these systems. So later on, we'll sort of follow this thing down at depth with drilling and geophysics. And just have a little closer look at these rocks. Okay, here's more a larger fragment with a lot of these banded sediments. So these are basically veins forming, silica forming on surface, hydrothermal silica, and then you're getting a little bit of sediment as the thing erupts. You shake things around, a little bit of sediment pours down, and you're getting interlayered silica along with sediment to create these bands. But it tells you were on surface at the time this thing formed. And this is a very interesting picture, and it's a rock sample that caught a lot of attention at the resource conference in St. John's last month. Attracting a lot of attention by geologists and obviously lab gold. But it's interesting because we know that breccia had to have formed prior to the main diatreme, but in this case, we actually get another phase of the diatreme cutting it because we actually see fragments of the hydrothermal breccia within that. So again, indications of a very long-lived hydrothermal system, which is what you need to grow a large gold or porphyry copper deposit. A few other features that attracted attention. Number one, these very weird rocks. This one we think it was obviously a porphyry, and when you deal with copper porphyries, you need a porphyry stock. So these are the intrusions. Sometimes they're felsic, sometimes they're mafic, often they're both. But you need these intrusive rocks on which your copper porphyry has then formed, and we're now seeing those evidence. We never really saw porphyry rocks on surface at root and cellar, and that was always one of the sort of negatives is if you have a copper porphyry, where are your porphyry intrusions? Well, we now see that. And then we also have, in this case, what looks like a B vein. B veins are known to be very diagnostic of copper porphyry systems. And this one actually has a tiny center line with chalcopyrite or copper sulfide mineralization down the surface. So, there's never one particular evidence that points at a copper porphyry, but see, these are some of them and some of the more clear-cut ones of a porphyry system. And so to sort of summarize what we have, we're obviously now seeing the evidence of the complete system at root and cellar. We have the gold-bearing zones, both the low sulfidation like Conquest, The intermediate sulfidation at drop zone, where we have very high silver ratio tellurium as well as lead zinc. Now in the pits, we're seeing more evidence of hydrothermal breccia and obviously a lot of copper mineralization, both hosted within the pipe and now fragments that are presumably been brought up from depth. And this is ultimately what we want to be targeting for the copper porphyry. We see these fragments of copper porphyry, but they've been blasted up by this diatreme pipe. And so you assume the source of that is somewhere below the diatreme pipe. But you never know whether, in this diagram, the intrusive stock is right below the diatreme breccias. That's not always the case. It can be off to the side. And that's why you want to be a little bit careful about running in and strictly drilling right underneath the diatreme breccias or the quarries in this case. So again, just taking a step back, because this is actually a diagram we had a few years ago when we first optioned the property, and it kind of just reinforces the message. We knew there was a copper porphyry potential then, and now it's really beginning to come to light. And then when we step back and look at, again, some of the other early evidences, we have here this very large copper anomalies, as we've already seen. Then on the flanks of that, with these orange darts, are what we call shoulder anomalies. Often in these copper porphyry systems, you'll get very anomalous arsenic, antimony, and a few other elements on the flanks of the copper porphyry, not within it. And we very clearly see here a distinct zonation. You are getting your copper and then your arsenic and your antimony and your pathway and other elements on the side. And again, the blue dots here, these are tellurium soil samples. So again, it clearly seems to suggest that there's some structures in here that are leaking up tellurium. Tellurium can be converted to a volatile phase very, very readily. And so it sort of vaporizes, so you can get it transported up through faults quite readily, and then it's trapped in the soils. And then as you continue that into the Conquest zone, which is here again, these blue squares are the tellurium-rich samples we're getting along with the gold. And it happens to sit exactly on these structures that we're then seeing tellurium anomalous soil samples to the southwest. So that kind of relates both the gold and the porphyry copper system together. But a classic signature for porphyry copper, where you're getting your shoulder anomalies and then a very distinct zonation of copper plus or minus mineralization in the center. And so I say these things, epithermal gold and porphyry copper are related, as we've just seen. And here is an example, a real world example of both a preserved epithermal gold. This is called the Panto in Philippines. And they have both the gold bearing zone along these flat-lying structures. Then at depth, you have the porphyry copper stock, but it's actually all within reach of surface. So, you go back to the exploration models, as I showed you before, these are models, but they do actually occur in real life scenarios, as exemplified by Lepanto, where you get both the gold and the porphyry. When you explore these systems, you never know whether the gold is the main commodity or the copper porphyry, or perhaps like Lepanto, they're both. We still don't know that at Northern Shield. But there's absolutely no reason why we don't have a similar situation happening here at Root Cellar, where we have both the gold and the porphyry copper. And I say we have been focused on the gold, but all summer when we're driving back and forth to the drill rig at Conquest Zone, we're passing these pits where they're blasting and exposing the diatreme breccias. And I say it was, after a while, we just could not sit back and simply bypass what we were seeing. In fact, we had several majors on the property throughout the year and the last few years. And, they too were saying you need to be focusing underneath these diatreme breccias, because they're pretty significant. They often host some of the world's biggest gold and porphyry copper deposits. So we're certainly beginning to see signs of that right now. So current planned work, I say we were initially going to rush in there and do a drill program either before Christmas, if we got the permits, or after. Now with this financing and with further insight, we're going to step back and do some geophysics in that area of the Crescent copper target, because I say we don't know whether the porphyry is off to the side or right underneath. So instead of just rushing in with the drilling, we will do some geophysics, probably MT or magnetotellurics or IP. And do more internal mapping of these diatreme breccias with the aid of a specialist in copper porphyry. We've completed a soil sample survey over Braxton Bradley, which is at the northeast end of the project compared to Crescent, but it does show some similarities to Crescent in that there's copper there and also tellurium. along with moly, lead, zinc, and gold. So it's sort of like the mirror image of Crescent. So we wanted, again, to try to get a better understanding of what was happening there. So we just completed a soil sample. We also have numerous samples that are in the shop right now that have been collected from the quarries and in and around that area. More samples were collected just the other day by the prospector after a recent blast in the pits, and these will all be sent in for assay. And so, again, for those of you that are unfamiliar with root and cellar, one of the really impressive things about it is not just the geology and the technical information, but its location. It is right off a paved highway. Here are the pits right here, just a few hundred meters off the highway. Even the Conquest gold-bearing zone, you can literally get to it in driving in a two-wheel drive Beetle if you want, and then you just have to walk the last few hundred meters. So access is quite incredible for an untouched epithermal gold and porphyry copper system. These are always often halfway up the mountains. If you look at BC or Chile or in jungles, if you look at the southern Pacific Rim. But we got a deep water port at Marystown, underutilized and just off the highway. So, access to root and cellar really doesn't get much better. So on top of all the technical data that's supportive, it's in a really, really good area. And it's ice-free or snow-free most of the time. We are getting snow quite early in the winter this year, but generally the Burin Peninsula is fairly warm and snow is not a problem. And so just to summarize, we have ongoing mineral discoveries that are proving up a camp scale, opportunity for both porphyry, copper, and epithermal gold. We have the strategic sort of advantage in this area as being the first mover. There are other epithermal gold systems in the Burin Peninsula and the Avalon, but we're probably the most advanced right now on the understanding of the system, at least in that area. And certainly, root and cellar compares many characteristics with other world-class copper and epithermal gold deposits. And some of that's tellurium, which is very rare. But there's also just down the road from root and cellar is a fluorite mine. And if you go to places like Nevada, there's a lot of fluorite and a lot of tellurium. And of course, you have some of the largest epithermal gold deposits in Cripple Creek. So, great similarities between some of the world's biggest copper and gold districts with root and cellar. And so we know both on the gold side, we've hit the center zone or the Giza sediments, and same in the Crescent copper zone. We see the very, very tops of the copper system. So this system is completely intact, even though it's 575 million years old, it's still intact, and that's rare on its own. And obviously you got high grades of gold with up to 78 grams per ton in outcrop and significant copper values. And of course, I say root and cellar owns 100% of the project. And, it's, as I said, it's on the Atlantic seaboard, which is strategic itself, I think. And it's minutes from a paved highway and deep water port. So we think when it comes to the technical side and the access, early stage opportunities like this don't get much better. And so I'd like to conclude with that. Happy to answer any questions if there are any. Thank you very much.
Great. Excellent presentation, Ian. Thank you. We'll kick off the question section now. Ian, you just announced a significant $1 million strategic finance with Labrador Gold. What are your thoughts on this partnership, and why is this the right deal at the right time for Northern Shield?
Well, in simple terms, it gives us the money and at a premium to the market price to conduct more thorough exploration on the property. We raised some back in October, November, which gave us enough to do at that time a planned drill program that was rushing in to do the drilling. Now we finally have the money, or most of the money, to sort of sit back and plan a full year of exploration, not cut corners, but do the proper geophysics and get the proper experts involved. And the idea is to now start building up towards a 5,000 meter drill program. That may be over a couple of drill programs, but instead of just rushing in there and doing a small, 1,500 meter, 2,000 meter drill program in the quarries, now the idea is to build it up to 5,000 meters on both the gold and the copper porphyry, but do the thorough work before that. But also, if you take a step back, the management of Lab Gold have decided to undertake a change of business, and that's into a sort of a hybrid junior miner stroke investment fund. But where specifically a portion of their funds are aimed at undervalued early stage projects. And these are, early stage projects are always higher risk. And so it's been harder for Northern Shield or any other company to access those funds. But there's also opportunities in early stage projects. That's where big discoveries are made. And credit to Roger, Roger and his team have recognized that opportunity and sort of found a niche market in the early stage projects that are undervalued.
Mm-hmm.
And sort of secondly, our own colleagues in the junior mining industry are often our greatest critics or skeptics. And so when a fellow CEO, comes up and says, "Hey, I like your project, I want to invest," you listen. And when other geologists at the show are interested in the project, as you say, you sit up and take notice, because they often are our greatest critics. So when they like it, it's a strong stamp of approval, to the market for a start, and it means we can tap into their expertise. I mean, Roger is well known, well regarded in the industry, so it allows us to also tap into their network and their technical background. And I say they are very technically inclined. They know Newfoundland and Labrador geology very well. I know they've been focused on this part of the world for some time, and they recognize the significance of what we have at Root and Cellar, which is just what I showed you, and that we have an intact epithermal and porphyry copper system, and those are rare to find intact, and we have one that's extremely accessible. And it's a matter of now sort of drive it forward. But despite all the indications we have, it's still sometimes it's been hard for me to sell the idea, because Newfoundland is not well known for being a copper porphyry or epithermal district. It shares very similar geology to parts of BC, like the Golden Triangle, parts of Nevada. But there's no geological reason why they shouldn't be there. We know they're there. We see these epithermal deposits. And if you have epithermal systems, the porphyry copper are somewhere underneath. Whether you can reach them, you don't know. But the porphyry copper are there. So the potential is very much here. But it's always been a little bit of a struggle to convince people here that, or anybody, that you basically have a new district. But Roger sees the opportunity there. He's a geologist, so he understands the geology. And so it's when someone is going to take that risk of an early stage project and think outside the box. I mean, we thought outside the box to explore this tract of land, which I say wasn't well known on the radar screens for epithermal gold and porphyry copper, but it has the geology that supports it, and Roger recognized that. So, it's innovative thinking on our behalf to set that off down this road in the first place, and they now them sort of recognizing the opportunity.
Mm-hmm. Now the financing structure is quite unique: subscription receipts, technical advisor rights, and preemptive participation rights. Can you walk us through why you structured it this way? And we know they're interested, but what strategic advantages does this partnership bring beyond just capital?
Yeah, well, it's not about we structured it this way. A lot of it was on behalf of Lab Gold, because I mean, the structure which you mentioned, subscription receipts, et cetera, that's more to the fact because they're now doing a change of business plan, and that requires shareholder approval and filings with the TSX. I don't want to get too much into it because that's their realm, but it's a change of business plan. So there's a time frame between signing the subscription agreement essentially and then receiving the money, because it has to go through their shareholder approval, and there's always notices involved, time frames to get there. And so it's a little bit unusual circumstance, but that's simply because they're going through that change of business right now. But there's a little bit of a risk to that for Northern Shield, because at the end of the day, Lab Gold shareholders may not approve this, but if they don't approve it, it might, again, it doesn't necessarily mean they don't like Root and Cellar property. It just means that they may want Lab Gold to stay as a junior miner and not an investment fund. And so there was a risk, and that's why we got a premium to market at 6 cents when we were trading at the time at 4.5 cents when we were discussing it. So that's why there's a little bit of an odd structure to this. But the advantage is we share some technical expertise. Then we can also tap into their sort of network on IR and financial background too of who they're connected with. So there's the technical side, there's the IR side. Mm-hmm. But again, it's important for us to have someone that recognizes the potential of Root and Cellar. And yes, as I said, we've had some majors interested in here, but to Roger's credit, he moved quickly. So we want to move this thing forward rapidly. And, this money gives us that opportunity if it comes through. And as I say, we tend to think outside the box. And I think Roger finding this sort of niche market of underexplored early stage explorers was also thinking outside the box. And, sometimes fortune does favor the brave. And I think it's a good partnership. And I think we can both drive this forward collaboratively very, very rapidly in 2026. And that's our plan.
I just want to take a moment to remind people to feel free to submit questions in the chat. There are a couple here. Charlie's asking, and I'll just read it verbatim here. Hi, Ian. Thank you for the presentation. You may answer my question throughout the presentation, though. You mentioned both 300 and 400 meters at root and cellar, and also 100 meters. I'm assuming you probably meant 300 to 400 meters plus 100 meters. In any event, there's a compelling evidence we are not yet at depth. How deep will we drill during the next drill program? Secondly, will this drill program start soon? There's a bit of work that needs to be done at Crescent before drilling, and I'm interested to know if drilling will commence shortly after root and cellar. Yeah,
so the drilling in this summer did go down to the 300 to 400 meter depth range. I forget whether that was vertical or downhole, but it was roughly around 300 meters, perhaps a little bit deeper. Most of those deeper holes hit alteration that was consistent with epithermal gold and or porphyry copper. We did hit some of those structures underneath the Conquest zone, a few hundred ppb, which is still significant. It's not high grade, but it's telling us the structures go down at depth. So we did hit mineralization deep underneath the Crescent zone. But the deepest we really hit, sort of the higher grade, was that crustiform coliform banded quartz vein, which is clearly epithermal, and that's at 100 meters. So that's kind of the deepest true epithermal mineralization we've hit in the Conquest zone. The stuff we hit at 300 or 400 meters, it's mineralization, it's sort of disseminated pyrite. It's probably related to the epithermal system, but we don't really know for sure. But the stuff I mentioned at 100 meters depth, that crustiform banded with the ginguro bands in it, that is really the deepest we've hit true epithermal mineralization in the Conquest zone, at least. So we will be following that in the next drill program. So what we're going to do is do some structural surveys, downhole structural surveys, have someone come and map and look at the core a little bit better, and maybe some new geophysics at Conquest, but I think we're probably good there. But it's really looking at having a better look at the structure and determining, do we continue to chase this, much deeper down at 300 or 400 meters, or do we just follow it more, go back to the 100 meter depth and follow it? Because again, it may not be a vertical thing like Lepanto. You always tend to think in gold, especially when you're used to our team, that these are subvertical structures, but they can go laterally a long way, as that case with Lepanto. So we want to be careful about chasing it too deep right there, because it may be a sort of a slant either back towards the copper porphyry or perhaps to the east for a variety of reasons. We think it may be something maybe plunging off to the east, and there might be another porphyry copper off to the east as well. But so the plan is to go back and do some more drilling in the Conquest zone, follow up on that ginguro banding. How deep we go, we may be a little bit more cautious and follow it slowly this time rather than jumping to depth, unless there's some reinterpretation on the structure that tells us. But we will at least go back to that ginguro banding and try to follow where that goes, because it's actually a pretty good width. I mean, the quartz veins sometimes were fairly small, but it was all over about a 4.5, 5 meter width of quartz veining, and that's the most quartz veining we've seen to date on the property as well. So we'll, that probably hasn't disappeared that quickly. So it's a matter of following it in the right direction.
Right. Follow-up question from Charlie. Is Northern Shield planning to engage a company like Apex Geoscience in order to help identify drill targets?
Well, we're engaging a number of specialists in the epithermal copper porphyry world. That's first to sort of map some of these rocks and look at the drill core and the alteration. So yes, we will be. I'm not going to say who we're going to use, but we are tapping into some worldwide experts on these porphyry copper systems. The alteration here it's pretty complex because we have the gold and the porphyry, and there may be two different age of mineralization, that we have overprinting alteration, and that's what's creating some of the I guess the fog is a good problem to have because it means there's multiple systems there, but it's making understanding it a little more complex. So we are going to be bringing in some experts on these systems to help us better understand the geology. But again, with the geophysics, we're going to have a geophysical experts look at, first advise us on what type of geophysical survey to use. And the moment that's sort of between MT and IP, and we're going through the steps right now of determining what that will be, and that we should have a conclusion on that very, very soon. And then, of course, once we get the data, getting the right people in to interpret that.
So you said at the Mineral Resource Review Conference in St. John's, you noted increasing interest in Avalon terrain porphyry systems. What's driving this industry attention, and what makes the Root and Cellar project stand out in this context?
Well, it's the rocks. It was the pictures I just showed you, except they were on the, they're largely sitting on a desk, and then I gave a presentation and sent you the same presentation that I just gave here. But it's the conference here is more of a technical conference. It's other academic, it's other geologists from other mining companies. It's not investment orientated, though an investment did come out of it through Lab Gold. Well, I'm sure I've been following the project for a while, but I say I don't think we can point to one individual body of evidence to say that was a tipping point. It's just a cumulative, the diatreme breccias on their own. Okay, these things that tell you how you have an active interaction of magma and water, so you're getting explosion. So that's a good thing, and they're often related with some of the world's biggest copper porphyry and gold deposits. Then we're slowly seeing more. Prospector found copper mineralization in the breccia pipes before. That was more that vein style. We weren't sure what that was related to, but now we're starting to see what looks like primary copper porphyry mineralization. We're seeing these porphyry intrusive rocks, which need to be there for a copper porphyry. We're seeing more things like moly. So this is not just a copper porphyry. This is probably a polymetallic copper, moly, gold, tellurium system, and so that adds obviously value to it, and its location, and then the hydrothermal breccias. I think those hydrothermal breccias we found late in the summer in the pit. Probably there's one thing that kind of excited us the most. It was that, because it clearly shows we're active plumbing system. It tells us that we were at the top, and it has all the classic pathfinders that we want to see. And so with what we're finding on the surface, things are changing very, very rapidly. With just a little bit of expansion of the pits and further prospecting on our own in the pits and outside the pits, we're seeing quite rapid changes in mineralization. And I say there's been a recent blast, and the prospector's been in there, and we'll have a closer look at these rocks, get them assayed, and disclose those as soon as we have a closer look at them. But things are changing rapidly, and I think it was just a accumulation of evidence that excited both geologists, the academic world, the mining industry, and of course Lab Gold. That we have all this mounting evidence, and you just can't. Just like we in the summer, we couldn't sit back and pass this copper when going to the gold anymore. When you start seeing these rocks, like, okay, we have to pay attention to them, and it just became a tipping point that there's overwhelming evidence there that there is a proper porphyry system there. Now we just got to do the thorough work, the geophysics to follow that depth.
Now, you probably already addressed this ad nauseum, but I'm going to ask it again just in case there's something we're missing here. But Northern Shield is known for its model-driven exploration approach to reduce early-stage risk. How has this methodology specifically guided your work at Root and Cellar? What gives you the confidence you're on the right track?
Well, I think you give us confidence we're on the right track is almost daily we're finding more either mineralization or other rock types which may not be so sexy and press releasable, but there's rock types we're finding there that help keep saying yes, we're heading in the right direction. If we were to get in there and stop finding what we're looking for, which is mineralization or evidence of hydrothermal activity or the right rock types, we'd walk away. But what gives us confidence is we're constantly finding more samples and exposures that are telling us that we're onto this system. Right?
Right.
So, we do follow a model-driven approach, and we were focusing on the gold, and now we're coming back to look at the copper, and it does seem to be an intact, complete porphyry and epithermal gold system. And when money's been hard to come by, as it has been the last few years, especially for the early stage explorers, unfortunately you have to cut corners, a little bit. So we kind of veered away from our model-driven approach, to be honest. But that's why we want to get back to, and we like to have that funding in place for a full year of exploration, because it does allow us to pursue it in a proper fashion.
And again, to reiterate, what makes you think Runeseller could host a large, well-preserved epithermal gold and porphyry copper system?
Well, we see the tops of both systems. We see where, these things would have gushed to surface 500 million years ago. So we know we're at the very top. We know both on the gold side, they're gold bearing. It's unusual to get that amount of gold at the very top, but we're seeing that. And now we're seeing the same thing in the quarry. That breccia, hydrothermal breccia, that's sort of blackish gray rock, that's a hydrothermal breccia, and that's also showing signs that it was in a little, geyser pool. And so we know that's at the very top of the system. So we know it's intact because we're seeing the tops of it. And even though it's 500 million years old, for various reasons, it's been preserved. We can tell by the stratigraphy that it's relatively upright too. It hasn't been pushed on its side. It may have been tilted a little bit, but it's not up on end. And now the only thing is, is it big, and and does it continue to depth? And only drilling will tell. But certainly when you look at the Crescent copper target, which is 2 kilometer diameter of soils and rock samples, that suggests it's big. I'm not saying the whole target is that big, but it's a big footprint to start with. And I see, and then you got sort of what I call circumstantial evidence by being on that extension area. Something weird is happening there. That the portion of the Burin. We have the tellurium. Those are often associated with big systems. We have fluorite down the road, which again, a lot of people, some of the other majors have caught on to that. But you see, you go to Colorado, Nevada, the fluorite is nearby to some of these big copper and gold systems. So yeah, it's intact. It's clearly intact, and we see the very tops of it. And then the only worrying thing is, first, when we knew we're at the top of the epithermal gold system, was the copper going to be too deep to get through? But clearly, we're seeing mounting evidence in the quarries of copper mineralization and lead zinc, which you often get is more mobile. So it's often associated to the flanks of the top of a porphyry system. So we know we're at the top, and we know it's mineralized, and now it's just a matter of finding exactly how big and how deep it goes.
Ian, as we wrap up here, looking ahead to 2026, what are the key milestones and value inflection points shareholders should be watching for? What would define a successful year for Northern Shield? Well,
first, obviously, we'd like to, close the transaction with Labrador Gold, which will happen probably sometime in late February. If that doesn't happen, we have a lot of other interested partners, but it's to get the funding in place. We've nearly got it all in place for the full 2026 plan program. But we like to drill into some copper mineralization. Now, the only thing is, are we going to drill into the breccia style copper mineralization or the porphyry? But we'd like to get well into either the gold system or the copper, or the heart of the copper porphyry. And so hopefully with a 5,000 plus meter drill program, we can do it, but it's going to be staged. So it's getting the rest of the financing. The geophysics, I think, is going to be really exciting. I want to get that done, the MT or the RP. We haven't done any geophysics other than magnetics over the copper porphyry. We've done it over the gold. We haven't done it over the copper target. And so I think that's going to be very interesting. Probably the first really big turning point. But we're moving ahead. We've already permitted, or we're put in an application for drill permits. We may have to change that based on the geophysics. But it's having this strategic partnership with Lab Gold and perhaps even another company like this deal doesn't restrict us from partnering up with other investment opportunities. But we've got interest. We think we got the winds on our back here, which is quite often in Newfoundland, and the mounting evidence. And a lot of that has also to do with the very hard work of the prospector who's, lives in Marystown. So he's out there as much as he can. Even when we don't have field crews on the ground, he's out there poking around. So he's excited. He hasn't sold any shares in the company, so he's doggedly pursuing this thing as well. So I think with a partnership with Lab Gold behind us, both financially and with their just having their technical support, and it's a great shot of confidence to have somebody in the industry want your project. As I say, often we're our own greatest skeptics, but a lot is happening there at Root and Cellar, and it's beginning to be overwhelming evidence that we're onto something, and hopefully this year we can push forward to fruition. And I think a good drill hole into the gold portion or the copper, but we are going to focus on the copper initially, because it's a bigger target, and maybe we even hit the gold, but there certainly seems to be something down there.
We have one more question that just sneaked in here. Ian, are there any concerns regarding shareholder dilution? Yeah,
I mean, no one likes to dilute, but without dilution, without raising money, we're sitting here, right? So, we think it's better to try to keep the property intact ourselves and others not option it out. If it's big enough, if it's big as it is, a little bit of dilution we're taking now, I don't think will be overly concerning. But of course, no one likes to dilute. It's in the reality of the market, especially for the juniors the last few years. I know they're improving now, but that takes time for it to trickle down to the early stage explorers like us. So it is a concern. We had a robust discussion on it at the board level, but we felt that it was, we needed to take on Root and Cellar properly. But there's offer for the financing to sort of plan for a full year, and we thought it was the best to take that and hit it quite hard. I mean, we're doing a lot of work at Root and Cellar, a lot of desktop studies, not only on the ground, and it's all very encouraging. And so we thought, though no one likes dilution, it was, getting out there and doing some work was a better option of sitting there and doing nothing and waiting for something to happen, or rushing in and drilling a copper porphyry target without doing geophysics.
Yeah, definitely.
It doesn't make a lot of sense. I know we were looking to go down that road just to avoid dilution, but in the end, we thought it was better to, conduct proper exploration and follow proper exploration steps.
Excellent. Ian, thank you so much for the market update. It's great to see Root and Cellar is finally garnering some interest here, but we look forward to hearing some more updates in the new year. Thank you for the presentation. Thank you, everyone, for submitting questions.
Thank you, Carl. Have a good night.
Yeah, you too. Take care, everyone. Bye now.